Hello, my name is Cameron Brown, and this is my project for the impact of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The first topic I will be talking to you guys about is the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 1950s and the 1960s for Black Americans to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. The Civil War had officially abolished slavery, but it didn't end discrimination against Black people. They continued to endure the devastating effects of racism, especially in the South. By the mid 20th century, Black Americans had more than enough of prejudice and violence against them. They, along with many white people, mobilized to begin an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned a lifetime of 2 decades.
End of the Civil War and the dawn of Reconstruction, African Americans still found themselves fighting for their basic rights as citizens. The modern civil rights movement in the mid-20th century finally secured them.
Most historians actually date the start of the formal civil rights movement to Brown versus Board of Education. Brown really stokes the fervor of the nation. Then, in December of 1955, Rosa Parks decided as an act of resistance that she would not give up her seat to a white man on the bus.
Rosa Parks' deliberate act of resistance led to a bus boycott that thrust into the limelight a young preacher with a PhD. He would become one of the movement's most charismatic leaders. His name was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
One of the most iconic moments is the March on Washington in 1963, led by Martin Luther King Jr.
200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights.
In fact, during the Reconstruction, Black people took on leadership roles like never before. They held public office and sought legislative changes for equality and the right to vote. In 1868, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution gave Black people equal protection under the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment granted Black American men the right to vote. Still, many white Americans, especially those in the South, were unhappy that people they once enslaved were now on more or less equal playing field with them. To marginalize Black people and keep them separate from white people and erase the progress they made during Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws were established in the South beginning in the late 19th century. Black people couldn't use the same public facilities as white people, live in many of the same towns, or go to the same schools. Interracial marriage was illegal, and most Black people couldn't vote because they were unable to pass voter literacy tests. Jim Crow laws weren't adopted in northern states. However, Black people still experienced discrimination at their jobs or when they tried to buy a house or get an education. To make matters worse, laws were passed in some states to limit voting rights for Black Americans. Moreover, Southern segregation gained ground in 1896 when the U.S. Supreme Court declared Plessy versus Ferguson the facilities for Black and white people could be separate but equal.
2012 movie, Abraham Lincoln spells out the terms of Reconstruction.
All they heard was the first time any president has ever made mention of Negro voting.
In 1865, he said freed slaves who were intelligent or had served as soldiers should be allowed to vote. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, guaranteed this right as part of the full citizenship accorded to African American men. But for much of the 20th century, voting remained a contentious issue. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, gave women the right to vote, but the racial divide remained. Some states continued to limit voting, either through measures like the poll tax or direct intimidation of African American voters. In the South, there were even whites-only primaries.
We shall
This is Sam Tannenhouse of the New York Times. The first modern Civil Rights Act was signed by President Eisenhower in 1957. It created a federal commission authorized to enforce voting rights. Senator Strom Thurmond conducted the longest filibuster in history, more than 24 hours, in an effort to thwart the bill. But it passed.
My next topic of discussion would be the Selma Montgomery March. The Selma Montgomery March was a part of a series of civil rights protests that occurred in 1965 in Alabama, a southern state with deeply entrenched racist policies. In March of that year, in an effort to register black voters in the South, protesters marching the 54-mile route from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery were confronted with deadly violence from local authorities and white vigilante groups. As the world watched, the protesters, under the protection of the federalized National Guard troops, finally achieved their goal, walking around the clock for 3 days to reach Montgomery, Alabama. The historic march and Martin Luther King's participation in it raised awareness of the difficulties faced by black voters and the need for a National Voting Rights Act. Voters' registration efforts in Alabama. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forbade discrimination in voting on the basis of race, efforts by civil rights organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Council, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, to register black voters met with fierce resistance in southern states such as Alabama. But the civil rights movement was not easily deterred. In early 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLS decided to make Selma, located in Dallas County, Alabama, the focus of black voter registration campaign. King had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and his profile would help draw international attention to the events that followed. Alabama Governor George Wallace was a notorious opponent of desegregation, and the local county sheriff in Dallas County had led a steadfast opposition to black voter registration drives. As a result, only 2% of Selma's eligible black voters, about 300 out of 15,000, had managed to register to vote. My next topic would be Bloody Sunday. On February 18th, white segregationists attacked a group of peaceful demonstrators in the town of Marion, Alabama, and ensuing chaos, and Alabama state troopers fatally shot Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young African-American demonstrator. In response to Jackson's death, King and the SCLC planned a massive protest march from Selma to the capital of Montgomery, Alabama, 54 miles away. A group of 600 people, including activist John Lewis and Jose Williams, set out from Selma on Sunday, March 7, 1965, a day that would become known as Bloody Sunday. The marchers didn't get far before Alabama state troopers started wielding whips, nightsticks, and tear gas rushed the group at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and beat them back to Selma. The brutal scene was captured on television, enraging many Americans and drawing civil rights and religious leaders of all faiths to Selma in protest. Hundreds of ministers, priests, rabbis, and social activists soon headed to Selma to join the Voting Rights March. Edmund Pettus Bridge. On March 9th, King led more than 2,000 marchers, black and white, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but found Highway 80 blocked again by state troopers. King paused the marchers and led them in prayer, whereupon the troopers stepped aside. King then turned protesters around, believing that the troopers were trying to create an opportunity that would allow them to enforce a federal injunction prohibiting the march. The decision led to criticism from some marchers who called King cowardly. The night, a group of segregationists attacked another protester, the young white minister James Reed, beating him to death. Alabama state officials tried to prevent the march from going forward, but a U.S. District Court judge ordered them to permit it. Later, LBJ addressed the nation. 6 days later, on March 15th, President Lyndon B. Johnson went on national television. My next topic will be the need for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act responds to current conditions in voting by restoring the full protections of the original bipartisan Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was reauthorized by Congress in 2006, but gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. The bill does this by establishing a targeted process for reviewing voting changes in jurisdictions nationwide focus on measures that have historically been used to discriminate against voters. In fact, this year marked the 56th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the landmark civil rights legislation that fundamentally changed voting rights in our country by outlining discriminating practices at the ballot box, like literacy tests, and provided special enforcement provisions for areas of the country where voter discrimination was prevalent. And yet today, we are seeing history repeat itself as states across the country pass voter suppression laws that limit access to voting, impose harsher voter ID laws, reduce polling place availability, and make it difficult to cast absentee ballots. Together with the For the People Act, we need Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancements Act to ensure equal and unimpeded access to the ballot box for all Americans, including whites, blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, et al.
Congress are waging the fight of the century right now over our freedom to vote.
Never did I think that the cause for which our beloved colleague, Congressman John Lewis, and the foot soldiers, the cause for which they marched 56 years ago, the Voting Rights Act, would again require congressional action to restore its full protections. This reminds us that progress is elusive, and every generation must fight and fight again.
Let's back up. What's this fight all about?
First, we have to look back in history to understand what we're up against today.
With a stroke of the pen, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson made good on a promise that this country had failed to fulfill for more than a century. He signed the Bipartisan Voting Rights Act into law.
It ensured that millions of African Americans could finally cast a vote that counts.
By 1970, almost as many Black Americans were registered to vote in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina as had been registered in the entire century before 1965.
For democracy to work for all of us, it must include us all.
That's why Black, Brown, Asian American, and Native American people with disabilities, language minority voters, and women of all races organized movements throughout history to secure the freedom to vote. And it is why there have always been a handful of extremist politicians who sought to take it away.
My next topic would be Shelby County v. Holder versus Herder. On June 25, 2013, the United States Supreme Court struck down a key provision in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, also known as the VRA, in a 5-4 decision in the case of Shelby County v. Holder. Specifically, the court struck down Section 4B of the VRA because of the formula it provided to determine which states were subjected to Section 5's federal preclearance requirement. Invalidating Section 4B made it so that the federal preclearance requirement in Section 5 could not function until a new formula was created to replace the one that was struck down. Section 5 of the VRA states that the eligible districts needed to seek approval from the federal government to implement certain changes to election laws and procedures, and Section 4B defines eligible districts as the places that have voting tests in the place as of November 1st, 1964, and a turnout of less than 50% in the 1964 presidential election. To receive clearance for new election procedure, the district will have to prove to either a 3-judge panel of a Washington, D.C. court or the U.S. Attorney General that the new procedure will not negatively impact the right to vote on a daily basis of race or minority status. After the VRA was enacted, it caused an increase in minority turnout for elections. The voter restrictions post-Shelby decision. The Supreme Court ruling allowed many states to begin putting in new restrictive laws regarding the right to vote. Texas had announced it would put in place a strict voter ID law less than 24 hours after the Supreme Court decision was announced. Many other states that were previously not allowed to enact voter ID laws because of the VRA's federal preclearance requirement were able to do so. The Supreme Court decision has also led to an increase in voters being purged from voter rolls. Research from the Brennan Center suggests that some more than 2 million more people were purged from voter rolls between 2012 and 2016. Then would have been in Section 5 of the VRA had been left in place. Notably, North Carolina passed HB 589, a bill which put in a strict photo ID requirement, eliminated a same-day voting registration, and shortened an early voting period, among other restrictive policies. One policy in particular banned early voting on Sundays, which North Carolina admitted in court was because counties that offered it were likely to have higher black populations. HB 589 was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit on the basis that the law was designed to target African Americans with almost surgical precision. For the U.S. government to be able to prevent more restrictive laws from being passed without federal pre-clearance, it would need to find a new formula for the Voting Rights Act that would satisfy the Shelby v. County Holder decision, which is what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was written to do.